So this AS physical education video focuses on the phases of learning, which is part of our pink AMS section, acquiring movement skills. Pretty straightforward, but basically represents the different levels at which a performer might be at, or different levels of learning that they might be at. Here, directly from the specification, you've got to be able to identify Fitz and Posner's phases of learning. So they've identified 3 phases of learning, and there are certain characteristics of each of these phases, and you need to learn those. Apply these phases to practical activities. So, first up, what is learning? Here's Schmidt's definition: a set of processes associated with practice or experience leading to relatively permanent changes in the capability of skilled performance. So important elements of this definition that we need to pick out is it's a relatively permanent change. It comes from experience, or perhaps it comes from practice, and it's absolutely not a one-off. It's not luck. It's capability. So it's something that becomes more of a permanent change, either by experience and or practice, and is fairly consistent. It's not just one-off, you played well on a particular day. If you've learned something, you can replicate that consistently. You need to know the key characteristics of learning here. So, Fitz and Posner devised 3 phases of learning, and again we need to know the characteristics of each stage or each phase, and almost like the so what are the implications of a coach knowing what phase of learning somebody is in? How can it be helpful? The first phase of learning is the cognitive phase of learning. The second phase of learning is the associative phase of learning. And the third phase of learning is the autonomous phase of learning. So let's look at the characteristics of the cognitive phase of learning. So this is somebody who's very much a learner or a beginner. The cognitive gives you a bit of a clue, because if you can remember when you first learned a new skill, you had to concentrate so much. You were very much in your head, and cognition is about thinking processes. So it could be that this little person here is having to think so carefully about watching the ball, about standing sideways, about what their racket's doing. So cognitive is about thinking, actively thinking through the process of doing the particular skill. And what the learner is trying to do, or what the coach is trying to help the learner do, is create a mental picture or a mental image, i.e. they need to know what the skill should look like and ideally feel like in their head. At this point, probably they've got very little kinesthetic awareness, which means that they don't really know what the skill should feel like. So they're kind of trying to do the skill without necessarily knowing what's right or wrong about what they're doing. They could be quite awkward in their movements, so perhaps less coordinated. Sometimes, step forward at the wrong time or bring your arm back at the wrong time. So the subroutines aren't flowing sequentially necessarily. And as I said, if they're very conscious in this stage, they're thinking about everything they're doing. There's loads of trial and error during this phase of learning. So you might hit it once and it might be right. You might hit it another time, it goes on to the next call. So their performance is quite inconsistent, with quite a high proportion of errors. But that's part of learning. And at this stage, they would very much rely on the coach giving guidance. So external feedback or extrinsic feedback. Coach telling them, you did this right, but you did this wrong. Because they haven't got that own sort of self-feedback yet, they rely on external sources to give them help. So that's the cognitive phase of learning. The next one, the associative phase of learning. Now, this one can be particularly long. In fact, sometimes people don't ever leave this phase of learning, and sometimes people go back to this phase of learning. So this is kind of like your intermediate, your development stage. At this point, you've now getting a clearer mental image of what a skill should look like, and you're trying to work on mastering it, reducing those errors. So there's still an element of trial and error, but the errors are a lower proportion now, a lower percentage. You're beginning to get kinesthetic awareness, so you're beginning to get a sense of what the skill should feel like and look like. And actually what we're doing now is we're laying down in your memory the motor program of this skill. You're almost making more permanent the set of instructions in your brain of how to do this skill. And what's particularly important in this part of learning is that you learn in a variety of conditions. If you're learning to do a backhand, you might have to hit a backhand when you're up close to the net, when you're further away from the net. You might have to hit it down the line, you might have to hit it cross court, you might have to do slice or topspin. And when you're learning, you need to be exposed to all these different conditions and possibilities to build up schema. We'll talk about that in a later topic. So variety of, if you only ever learn to hit a backhand in one single situation, i.e. for example down the line, that's not going to help you in a game necessarily. Finally then, the autonomous phase of learning. This, as you might get from the picture, involves the elite performer, the performer who now has mastered the skill, who doesn't have to give a great deal of thought to performing the skill. It comes very automatically. So autonomous looks a little bit like, or sounds a little bit like, automatic. So this performer does it effortlessly, without thought. The motor program has become overlearned and it's now habitual. If a ball comes here, I do this. You do it as a habit because the motor program's stored in your long-term memory and you can call upon it to work automatically. Because you'll be able to do this skill automatically, you can now give your attention to other things. So you have spare attentional capacity. Your attention, there is spare room for you to give your attention to other things, and that sort of stuff might be trying to do a sneaky shot. So you might now give your attention to looking like you're going to hit down the line when actually you know you're going to hit cross court. So deception is something you might start thinking about. This performer has very high levels of kinesthetic feedback, so they can hit the ball and they know instantaneously if they've hit it wrong or if it felt perfect. They can give themselves intrinsic feedback and possibly self-correct if they need to. So they're automatically evaluating how it went. How did it feel like? So the autonomous learner, very much the end result, that natural player who looks effortless in their performance and can do the skill automatically, consistently and reliably. So what phase of learning are you in for your EPIP sport? Just for something for you to think about. It could be certain skills you're in different phases of learning. And as I said, you're not necessarily the same phase of learning for all activities. So it could be that your preferred sport, if it's netball or volleyball, you're perhaps associative or maybe even autonomous. But in your second sport, badminton, maybe you're a cognitive learner. You're still very much in that beginning phase. So you need to appreciate that you might be in different phases of learning for different sports or different skills.